Welcome. I am John Sangenberger, and I lead the Alumni Relations team at the Tepper School. We are so glad to welcome you to our second in our series of 4 webinars on the intelligent future, highlighting the interdisciplinary research initiatives at the Tepper School that unite our researchers, students, alumni, and industry leaders in their work to advance the understanding of important topics and how they shape business and society. Today's discussion will be on the intelligent future of sustainability, a very important topic for us here at the Tepper School and at Carnegie Mellon University. Before we begin, let me highlight other upcoming events that you may be interested in attending. First, our next webinar in our series will be on March 25th on the intelligent future of inclusive growth and prosperity. Will feature Tepper faculty presenters sharing their innovative research and insights with you. Then in April, you can join us for our last in this 4-part series on the intelligent future of healthcare, where we'll talk about the innovative projects and research that are being done here at the Tepper School with technology and our analytical insights. And last but not least, we want to introduce you to our upcoming reunion weekend. Registration is going to be going out this next week. We have 2 in-person alumni reunion weekends coming up in April and May. And registration will begin, as I said, next week. So we're very excited to have our alumni back on campus for an in-person reunion this year. Now, to introduce the Tepper School's role in leading the intelligent future, please welcome the 10th Dean of the Tepper School of Business, Dean Isabelle Béjou-Bassonneau. Dean Isabelle?
Thank you. Thank you so much, John, for the kind introduction, and welcome to all of our participants on this webinar. Thank you again for joining us for the second of our 4 webinars in the Intelligent Webinar series. Here at the Tepper School, we focus on building and teaching a better future for business. We call it the intelligent future. We prepare students to be visionary, dynamic leaders by equipping them with the right blend of analytical and soft skills. The future of business is data and technology, but the future of business leadership isn't simply crunching numbers and analyzing data. We're not trying to produce calculators, we're shaping ethical, creative, emotionally intelligent leaders who are committed to creating a more just, prosperous world. Our interdisciplinary initiatives here at the Tepper School serve as a stepping stones on our journey to the intelligent future. These initiatives include blockchain, healthcare, inclusive growth and prosperity, and sustainability. They unite researchers, students, donors, and industry to advance understanding of important topics and how they shape business and society. This webinar series will explore each of these interdisciplinary initiatives with Tepper School faculty experts and alumni leaders in their respective domains. In today's session, we delve into our sustainability initiative. The essence of sustainability is considering the impacts of actions today on outcomes in the future. The initiative encompasses a wide range of topics, including energy, natural resources and the environment, health and social well-being, engineering, and architecture. In light of the recent horrific events in Ukraine, I personally believe that energy security is an integral part of a more sustainable world, and I would welcome comments on that from the panel. Now, let's turn towards today's session. Nicholas Muller, Lester and Judith Lave Professor of Economics, Engineering and Public Policy, will moderate the discussion among alumni leaders who are at the forefront of the intelligent future and sustainability. Thank you again to all for joining us. I look forward to learning together today and throughout this webinar series. Nicholas, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Isabel. And I'll be the third to welcome all of our attendees to our webinar on the intelligent future of sustainability. Just a little bit about me and my background, so folks know, in a sense, where I'm coming from. I moved to Pittsburgh as a young guy at 3 years old and was here through high school, and then got a bachelor's at the University of Oregon, a master's at IU Bloomington, and then got my PhD in environmental economics at Yale. After earning my PhD, I spent some time at Middlebury College on the faculty and moved here to Tepper in 2017. I have served in a variety of roles in terms of service outside of the university. I spent time on the Scientific Advisory Board for the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and I've served as a consultant to a variety of public agencies as well as private sector firms. What I want to spend some time talking about, beginning with the next slide, is what the sustainability initiative consists of. And it really is built on 3 pillars. In terms of academic programming, the initiative was launched in 2019, and we quickly developed what we refer to as a sustainability concentration, which consists of coursework in energy, finance, policy, and economics, electricity markets, risk analysis, and sustainable operations. This sustainability concentration will merge with the existing energy track, and we are launching then a joint energy and sustainability track this fall. It will be an intensive course of study for MBA students, and it will culminate with a project course that builds on the existing project course in the energy track, in which students tackle actual business problems for external, typically corporate clients. Last year, for instance, the students worked on a problem for Honda. Also, in terms of new developments under the Sustainability Initiative's academic programming, is a new sustainability course for MBAs that will be launched in the fall of 22. In terms of the next pillar, the initiative hosts a variety of events in the academic year. The first one I want to note is an annual forum, the Technology, Sustainability, and Business Forum. This coming fall's forum will be our 4th. And this is, as I said, an annual event featuring a panel discussion with leaders from business, local and federal governments, and academia. We typically have an MBA student moderate the panel, and the students, that is, help build the question list and help with selection of panelists. I can't underscore enough what an impressive group of panelists we've had in the past, much like we have today, including the Vice President of Sustainable Finance from JP Morgan Chase, the President of S&P Global, the CFO from Alcoa, and the CEO from a manufacturing startup, X1. In terms of government, we've had lead negotiators in the UNFCCC COP24, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Chief Resilience Officer in the city of Pittsburgh, a commissioner from a local government in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania. We had a member last year from the Council of Environmental Quality from the White House. And then in terms of academics, we've had thought leaders from NYU, Columbia, and the University of Toronto. And then finally, in terms of research, the initiative has been generously supported since its inception by both Tepper and GSIA alumni. And that support is targeted towards PhD students here at Tepper, and that supports their time doing dissertation research. And so I've highlighted 2 topic areas where we have students in the sustainability initiative doing research that's supported from external sources. The first student is exploring the role of voluntary emissions disclosure in the utility sector in terms of driving subsequent emissions behavior and financial outcome for those firms, looking at a mix of voluntary and compulsory disclosure programs that the federal government in the US runs. The second student that I'm highlighting is looking at the relationship between voluntary disclosure and regulatory outcomes. And in particular, she's exploring whether when firms disclose, say, in annual reports to shareholders, emission quantities, do regulators of emissions then turn enforcement and inspection actions towards those firms that disclose? And these are important topics from the position of the interface between corporate behavior and regulation in particularly related to environmental notions of sustainability. We're also focusing with this external funding on building new approaches to managing or informing what is called ESG investing, that is environmental, social, and governance criteria for investing. We've developed a rigorous quantitative monetary scoring tool that goes beyond the existing metrics that just focus on carbon dioxide, and we're nearing a website launch of this initiative. Specifically with respect to these topics, I have given invited talks in the last year at Harvard, Imperial College London, the E-Access webinar, and the University of Mannheim. So that's my summary of the sustainability initiative's 3 areas here at Tepper. What I'd like to do now is introduce our 3 panelists. And the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to start with Greg Christensen. I'm going to introduce Greg, give you just a brief bio, and then I'll ask Greg a few questions related to sustainability. I'll then move on to Deborah Sturzing and do the same pattern, brief bio, a couple questions, and then move on to Keishi Hatsuki and finish there. And then we'll circle back with a few questions that alumni have submitted previously, and then we've got a couple questions to wrap up. So Greg Christensen is the Director of Manufacturing Transformation for the Ford Motor Company in North America. In his role, he's responsible for overseeing manufacturing, footprint requirements associated with transforming operations from internal combustion engines to battery electric vehicle production. This includes overseeing manufacturing planning for vehicles, batteries, and supporting supplier operations. Greg earned a Bachelor of Science degree in mechanical engineering at Brigham Young, where he was also captain of the soccer team. He has completed 2 master's degrees, a Master of Automotive Engineering from the University of Michigan, and an MBA here at Tepper, where he graduated with university honors. I should also note that in 2009, he was recognized by the Automotive Hall of Fame with their Young Leadership and Excellence Award for his work in global manufacturing, engineering, and planning. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. So the first question I wanted to ask is, what is Ford Motor Company doing to accelerate EV adoption and production?
Yeah, so thanks. For those that have been watching the news and paying attention to this particular space, the automotive industry, 2021 was a massive year in announcements. You know, certainly there's credit to be given to Tesla and some of those that have really pushed this, but you can see Ford's approach really coming to fruition. For us inside, we see all these great vehicles, and Ford is really focusing on the things that we can do best. The most iconic vehicles, Mustangs, F-150s, Transit commercial vehicles, and we're electrifying them immediately, very rapidly. For the F-150, for example, to go on sale this spring, we have doubled the capacity twice in 1 year in terms of our plans. So we originally came out with plans to build maybe 30 to 40,000. Then we doubled that to 60 to 80,000. Now we've publicly declared that in a year and a half, we'll be able to build 150,000 units. We have demand. We had to cut off reservations at 200,000 units. So there's such a pent-up demand on the customer side. We've really seen a change there. And for us, many of the steps we've taken is how are we going to capacitize to build all these units? And happy to talk as we go along around the effort that I was leading around bringing battery production and supply security. The Dean talked about securing our supply and energy independence to North America. Many of these materials come from around the world. Most of today's battery production is in Southeast Asia. And so the future of electrification and conversion from internal combustion engines to battery electric vehicles will be around the ability to scale and produce here in individual markets where we sell. So there's just a tremendous excitement and energy at companies like Ford Motor Company around the electric revolution.
Interesting. One thing I noticed in that answer was specifically with respect to adoption, the transformation or the joint production of iconic brands as EVs.
Yes.
My father-in-law just got one of the new Mustangs, and he was a guy who grew up with a regular ICE Mustang, loved the car, and now he loves this Mach-E. Is that a conscious strategic decision to sort of build out the iconic brands in the electric space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a differentiator we believe for us, but I think you'll start seeing it across the industry. There's an emotional connection to certain vehicles and brands. Now we're a Ford family, with family members, not just myself that work there, but my son, who's 13, talks about Mustangs, talks about Broncos. They're emotional, they mean something. They speak to who you are. They say something about your lifestyle. And now where there may have been compromises before, Bill Ford, our chairman, member of the Ford family, has always mentioned that he's an environmentalist, but as a car company, there was perhaps some conflict there in some ways. There isn't anymore. And so you can get your most iconic brands, your most passionate products, electrify them. And now, you've really unleashed some real ability to grow and scale when you do that.
That's really neat. Second question I have for you is how is Ford as a company thinking about battery recycling with all this potential new demand for these products?
Yeah, I think it's a real concern. And there's a couple of really neat proof points. What we announced last year, and I was a part of this as well, in my role, is we announced a partnership with a company called Redwood Materials. Redwood Materials is founded and run by J.B. Straubel, former co-founder of Tesla and chief technical officer. His company is already recycling every battery you can think of, from a toothbrush to a cell phone to a used electrified vehicle car battery, including hybrids that you would find in many of our products for the last decade. So we partnered with them because the wonderful thing that you have with battery electric vehicles is you can harvest so many of the precious metals that go into a battery and truly reuse them. So in the near term, you can recycle, in the case of Ford, hybrid electric vehicle batteries that are beyond their useful life or in cars that are now ready to go to the scrapyard. You can recycle scrap from the manufacturing processes. So whereas before you were struggling to do what you do with scrap, you can recycle that and pull out 95% plus efficiency of pulling those materials out. So Ford has partnerships. Battery companies around the world are starting to look at this. We just announced a pilot program with Redwood in the state of California, where there's a concentration of EVs, to really pilot and basically say to anyone that has used battery scrapyards or companies, we will come pick up your battery for free. We will pay the transportation costs, and we're going to start processing those batteries and taking materials and truly put them into your next vehicle, such that when you buy an EV, and this is going to scale over time as EVs scale, eventually we call it closed loop manufacturing. You're closing the loop, and we will be able to in the decades to come and years to come truly stop all the mining around the world and recycle time after time after time batteries. So it's a really exciting space. At our announcement, we had Governor Newsom from California, as well as the CEOs from Ford Motor Company and Redwood, really touting this exciting development.
That's really interesting. It leads into my next question, which is whether Ford has explicit goals regarding sustainability and reducing its carbon footprint.
Yeah. So obviously on the product side, so much more efficient to produce electricity for the grid in all kinds of different fashions than it is having a little generator under your hood. But our commitment really goes beyond just the EVs, right? And the production of EVs. We have very explicit goals around carbon neutrality. So by 2035, we want to have all of our energy to run our operations, to build these vehicles, to be 100% locally sourced renewable electricity by 2035. And then as a company to be truly carbon neutral by 2050, which those that are in that realm understand the nature of those commitments. Beyond the carbon reduction strategies, we have very clear water strategies around freshwater withdrawal and making sure that we're only using that for human consumption, waste strategies and air emissions as well, when it comes to our paint shops and things that do have some emissions. very aggressively attacking zero emissions in our factories, as well as making sure that our products have that same capabilities as zero emissions. So excited about where Ford's going. We put out an annual sustainability report that details some of the figures I just mentioned in terms of dates and objectives, and a lot more that people are able to get online.
Excellent. That's really exciting, Greg. I'm going to pivot now and introduce our next panelist before we have our plenary session in a moment. I'd like to introduce Deborah Sturzing, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Wind Energy Transmission Texas, a regulated transmission-only utility that owns and operates assets in Texas. Deborah oversees the finance, treasury, accounting, regulatory, and contractual functions for WET and has worked in the energy industry for over 20 years. She has held leadership positions at GE Power, at GE Hitachi Nuclear Energy, at Green Mountain Energy, and at Skya Energy. Deborah recently served as the transmission and distribution co-chair for the McCombs Initiative at the University of Texas at Austin, and she holds an MBA from 2014 at Tepper. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So the first question I wanted to ask is how you view the role of your sector, your industry, in the economy with respect to sustainability.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that as a transmission-only utility operating in Texas, we are not, we are electron agnostic, if you will. But we are more of an enabler of sustainable power for the grid. So our assets currently, our high voltage transmission assets currently only interconnect to renewable energy in West Texas. So we were certificated during the competitive renewable energy zone construction of the 16 gigawatts of wind. And subsequent to that, we've been interconnecting solar and battery storage. So many renewable energy generators will tell you that a limiting factor of their ability to build new plants is related to transmission and subsequent constraints that might be on the system, particularly in what is an energy-only market here in Texas.
Interesting. Along those lines, what market forces do you see as particularly important in impacting sustainability as we move forward?
Yeah. So in Texas, we have a reputation of being very oil and gas centric, but mentioning earlier that we're an energy only market means that economic forces really drive sustainability growth in the state, right? Particularly for power plant construction. We're not seeing new thermal load plants being built in Texas because they're expensive and their long-term economics aren't, with their fixed costs, aren't nearly as attractive as a solar or wind plant that can be built in a very short amount of time and produce energy. So economics are a key driver here in Texas because of the way our system is set up, but also tax credits, production or investment tax credits. So our counterparties who interconnect to us tend to require those tax credits in production from a wind side and investment from a solar side in order to make the economics work. And then, of course, access to solar panels for solar power. The good news for storage is that the federal government tax credits enabled solar construction to also include storage as part of the ability to get tax credits. Storage is basically a loss leader. You don't make a lot of money with merchant scale, utility scale storage, but when you combine it with solar and then you fill your power on your storage at night and then have it available for peak periods, it ends up being an economic solution.
Very nice. I was thinking as you were answering that question about the load that oil and gas extraction in West Texas might require. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about either WET's role or broadly the renewable sector's role in maybe mitigating some of the environmental impact of oil and gas extraction in West Texas.
Yeah, so, we talk about the two key demand factors here in Texas being related to population growth in the traditional population centers of Texas, like San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, and Houston. But there is also oil and gas load that's co-located with the West Texas solar and wind and storage assets. The way it works for development in West Texas is really in Texas is for renewable generators is they need to lease land. They typically don't buy or purchase land in order to put their wind or solar plants on property. So those lease agreements have to be cheap enough that they can do that, and land and dirt is cheap in West Texas. So the need or the drive to have renewable energy is because of both load growth in West Texas for oil and gas pumping, which is growing significantly, both because of the new reserves that have been found in the Delaware Basin, as well as what is now historically, high price of barrel of oil,
Right.
So yes, oil and gas pumping and load does drive some of the development in West Texas. It also impacts whether or not we need to build new transmission. Because as those new power plants come into play and the load moves west instead of east for the population centers, we are beginning to build new transmission lines more west than we have traditionally been east.
Very interesting. And as you were talking about storage a moment ago, I was thinking about the sort of maybe predictability of residential load. And I was wondering then, is there a predictable element to oil and gas load? Is it more just sort of constant base load? How do we think about that?
Yeah, it's we actually keep track of active pumping in West Texas, so we can measure it, and ERCOT does as well. There are quite a few, or there have been quite a few inactive pump jacks that have been, the price of oil, just if it's below $60 a barrel, they don't pump, right? But load is measured on a zonal basis in Texas. So, and also, so too is the price of power measured zonally. So I noted that there was a question that was asked by one of the alumni about why is it that you'll see wind turbines not generating when the wind is high, right? And that is because there is so much wind, the price, at least in Texas on a zonal basis, can actually go negative. So if you run your wind plant, you will effectively have to pay the grid to put power onto it. So oftentimes you'll see on a very windy day, wind not producing. But on days like that in Texas, we will also have all of our power produced by wind, right?
Sure.
We've had some like historic days where 100% of our power came from wind.
Very nice. And so in terms of your particular firm's impact on sustainability, how I think I see the answer, but how would you characterize that for our audience?
So I think we're a sustainability enabler. Without the roads to move the power, which is what we are, the transmission lines are the roads that the power moves on. The power is constrained and can't get out, and the economics just don't work for solar or wind or storage, right? And when you are dealing in a FERC jurisdictional type of area, which is not true for us, we are not regulated for our rates by FERC, which means it's easier for us to build new transmission. It means that there are fewer barriers to entry for those renewable energy providers who want to, build in our state.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Deborah. I'm going to pivot one more time introduce our third panelist, and then we'll come back to plenary. Our third panelist is Keishi Hatsuki. He is the Chief Risk Officer at Morgan Stanley. He joined the firm in March of 2008 as the head of Market Risk Department and became Chief Risk Officer in 2011. Mr. Hatsuki began his career at Fuji Bank in 1984, where he worked in the corporate finance and derivatives trading divisions. From 1993 to 99, Mr. Hatsuki worked at Bankers Trust as head of market risk management in Japan and Asia. Mr. Hatsuki then joined Merrill Lynch in 1999 as the head of market risk management for the Japan Asia Pacific region and was a senior VP and global head of market risk measurement from 2005 to 2007. Keishi holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Hitsubashi University and a master's of science in industrial administration from then GSIA here at Carnegie Mellon University. Mr. Hatsuki is a board member of the Japan Society. He is also a member of the advisory board of the Tepper School of Business and of computational finance at Carnegie Mellon University, and a member of the advisory board of Krieger School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins. Keishi, welcome.
Thank you.
Given your role as the Chief Risk Officer of a major Wall Street firm, how important is the sustainability issue, and what is the sustainability strategy broadly for Morgan Stanley?
Yeah, so short answer is it's very important, very significant. I just give you a sense that as a Chief Risk Officer, I attend board meeting every quarter, and now and then the more than that. And I recall that in 2021, we had 3 occasions of talking about sustainability and climate risk with the entire board. When I speak to our investment bankers who get involved in the boardroom of the major US corporations, this theme is becoming a number one theme among the major US corporations to talk about in the boardroom. And as an investment bank, this is a very important opportunity to help our corporates, because investment banking is to help the clients to do, to execute a major transition. And this is arguably the biggest theme or the transition that the U.S. corporates and global corporate has to go through in the next 10 years. And in terms of strategy, that's a great question. And Morgan Stanley is the first major U.S. banks to commit to the net zero financial emission by 2050. That we announced this back in September of 2019. So we have a very strong commitment. And as I said, given the opportunities, and also as a social responsibility matter, that we decided strategically we want to be a leader rather than a lagger to lead the transition, and particularly help the corporates to finance the opportunity for the transition.
So a follow-on question, what do you see? You've talked both about opportunities and challenges or risks associated with this transition, and I presume as transition, we're thinking about a transition to a lower or no carbon economy, to a more environmentally sustainable economy. Could you highlight maybe one major opportunity and one major challenge specifically, or one major source of risk that you face, particularly in the banking industry, or you might encourage your corporates to consider facing?
Sure. So let me start with the challenge part. So when we face the NGOs and many sustainability activist constituencies, the interesting message that we hear in the banking industry is they ask us to stop lending to fossil fuel companies, stop lending to the brown companies, and that's the pressure we get. But when you think about any other industry, such as Greg talked about auto, Deborah talked about power. In many industry, the pressure is slightly different. Pressure is, of course, I know that you are a car company, you will create cars, but they want you to move to EVs. They want you to move to the cleaner energy solution. And I think that should apply to the same standard, and the theme should apply to the banking. But at this point, it's not, because they ask us to say, stop lending to that brand company. The more important question is how we actually do the less brand lending and help our corporates to transition to the greener footprint. And that requires a tremendous financing. And that's why we exist. Try to help the corporates to get greener. And that's the opportunity. But the really going back to the broader challenges, we don't necessarily have the established framework about how to measure the success. Right. So that's an interesting challenge for the whole industry, that when you think about how to measure the emission, the direct emission by car companies and power companies and so on, that itself already have a challenge. And if people talk about scope 1 and scope 2, is easier to measure, but when you go to the indirect scope 3, there's so many different methodology, and a lot of industry is still struggling to understand it. Yeah. But then if you get to the finance industry, that's even more challenging, because let's say we have lending to Ford, or we have a lending to power company. And then they have a mixture of all the kinds of financing and lending on the balance sheet, and how we allocate their emissions to finance exposure is almost like the problem with another dimension. So try to come up with the right framework, try to come up with the right measurement, so that we can create the right incentive to the corporate and the financial industry. I think is the biggest challenge. And if we solve that puzzle, we can help the society in a major way to help the transition.
Makes a lot of sense. I have just one follow-on question, and that is, I'm listening to you talk about the sort of role of finance in helping corporate clients, possibly through lending, make a transition from, say, brown to green practices. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what's a possible role? And this is a very open-ended question. If you could just maybe pick one, what's a possible role for smart and targeted public policy in this space?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's easy to say, but it's very difficult to do, that if the major G7 countries' financial regulators can help us to create this consistent platform about how they will expect the banks to provide a financing for different types, and then clearly differentiate different type of transitional financing structure, so they can incentivize the banks to do the better thing, rather than just, as I said, stopping the lending. Right. That public policy will significantly help us to help the corporate. I give you one simple example. Right now, the banking industry, focusing on how to measure these financial emissions. And let's say I have a lending to one of those fossil fuel companies, and investment banker come to me and say, I want to help this client to get greener, and it's a project finance. So I know it's greener, but we don't know how to measure that net marginal impact. And then if I map the exposure to that fossil company, then that will just add additional finance emissions we are causing to the society. That's a negative incentive. So if that's the case and we are measured that way for the success, we don't want to do the lending. That's how important it is, how to measure the incremental impact on each financing, and then count the greener part of the financing structure in the right way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one of the research topics by a student here at Tepper, PhD student here at Tepper, who's supported by Alumni, is focusing on the role that compulsory disclosure of emissions has on subsequent firm behavior. And the really interesting finding is, with no regulatory binding limits on emissions, when the firms have to report, they reduce their emissions, right? Exactly. And so there's part of this framework that just its existence will fundamentally improve the way currently polluting firms will behave. Thank you, Keishi. Very interesting answers to the questions. I want to cycle back to Greg for a moment, if I could, with a question about the heavy duty and medium duty truck market from one of our alumni. And the question asks, how can the sustainability transition, say, from traditional internal combustion engine vehicles to battery electrics or hybrid electrics be accelerated in the medium duty and heavy duty market?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Certainly, there's an interaction of public policy here as well. There's been different proposals out there, probably focusing on the retail industry a little bit more than the commercial. But whether it's the current format that you have with ICE engines around regulatory approach, or in the case of EVs, the discussion has been more about incentive programs to support that. I would also say that the infrastructure element is a big part of the transition as well. So the more that there can be partnership between government and industry or auto on infrastructure, the more that I think you can help accelerate this process. The interesting thing is, as I bring an EV home and I take people around, I mean, the product itself, this is intertwined a little bit of commercial with retail, but I'll try to bring it back at the end. The product itself sells itself. I mean, the performance, a Mustang and an F-150, I mean, the acceleration, this F-150, you saw maybe President Biden driving the F-150, goes to 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. I mean, the performance there, the bilateral charging, you can actually power your home in areas of crises. So we had a hybrid electric F-150s, both in Michigan and Texas when there was the big ice storms. People were powering their homes with their vehicle for days. So that product really sells. Every day you get to leave the house with a full electric charge. You get to charge up your vehicle and have a full tank every day. On the commercial side, that isn't the case, right? You're not starting every day in your home. So I tell you, the $6 billion, I think it was, that was in the bilateral, the bilateral and cooperative legislation that came between Democrats and Republicans in the fall that was actually passed. The infrastructure bill dedicates a lot of money to that infrastructure, primarily around highway networks. So I think there's both incentives as well as infrastructure that will be key to seeing all parts of the auto industry transfer over. And as well as we drive costs down. Quite frankly, part of this is just about technology and development. Sure. And again, partnership between companies and government on research and development to drive costs down will be key for both retail and commercial customers.
That makes a lot of sense. That's going to feed in nicely to a question from alumni to Deborah. In particular, thinking about the environmental sustainability impacts of electrification, that's obviously going to depend on what we were talking about earlier, which is how we're sourcing our power. And with renewable sources, often intermittency is an issue, as we were talking about. So the question is, could you comment briefly on the role and the value of large-scale backup energy storage systems, in particular in enabling the viability of an upgraded grid relying on renewable energy?
Yeah, that is always the most interesting question that is explored at these renewable energy conferences that we go to, because everybody says, how is storage going to impact, grid reliability? And now the buzzword here in Texas is resiliency. Like Greg mentioned, the winter storm that we had last year told us in Texas that we don't have the most resilient grid, meaning once things go down, how do you get back up, right?
Right.
So storage, everybody believes storage is a game changer, right, for that intermittency. The question is, right now, you get about an hour worth of power, maybe 2 hours worth of power for a storage facility that takes up about 4 acres on, maybe a co-located solar plant, which is what's happening, right? They are trying to co-locate these storage facilities with other forms of renewable power. There's also a notion of wind and solar being complementary. This is discussed quite a bit in the market to say, when the wind is blowing, the sun isn't necessarily out, and vice versa. In Texas, we don't rely on wind as part of our power forecasting in the summertime, because the wind just does not blow as much in West Texas in the summer, right? But solar does, right? Solar, it's very sunny in West Texas in the summertime. The economics can be make or break on a solar generation facility if it's not in service by summertime. So storage assists with that, but utility scale storage has a long way to go from a technology perspective for it to be a game changer. And everybody really acknowledges that, right? There are, and this, Kishi mentioned something very important. The notion of transition is a key concept in our industry, right? It's going to take time. How long is debated. How we get there is another area of debate, right? But storage is considered a key part of that transition, because the key complaint with storage and renewable is you can't store it, right? Or solar and wind can't be stored. So how do you do that? You put a storage facility on there, but it needs to experience more of Moore's law to get there, right? We're not quite there from a technology perspective yet.
Sure. Thank you very much. That's very informative. And then again, a related question building off this for Keishi from Alumni. As we think about the sort of mix of market forces and policy forces and technological change, one particular aspect of this discussion that we haven't really touched on that's particularly relevant to finance is ESG and impact investing. And so the question is, how are companies that you interact with, or maybe your firm, incorporating ESG risk into their capital allocation decisions?
Yeah, so our primary focus on sustainability or the climate aspect of the ESG, because the S and G has a slightly different tone. Mm-hmm. There are two dimensions that we care. One is the actual potential financial risk that we will face, like a lending exposures and the trading exposure on carbon emissions, as an example. And if we are taking more risk around the fossil fuel, carbon emissions, and so on, and we do the stress testing. And we do the stress testing of whether it's a physical risk event, such as big flood, or the massive declaration of carbon taxes, we call transitional risk. How much can we lose? So if we have too much exposure to the fossil fuel companies, or that we have a large concentration on Florida or California for the real estates and so on, that we need to contain that risk. So that's kind of like one dimension. The other dimension is given that we have this commitment to reduce the financed emissions eventually to zero, and we are also one of the first banks to announce a commitment to have an interim target by 2030. So suddenly that this is becoming real. We are talking about 8 years later, how much of the reduction we have on the emission profile. So we can no longer finance a client who is still old-fashioned and continue to produce the carbon emissions. So we have to say no to those clients. And so going back to this measurement issue, so it is definitely start to impact our capital allocation in a very material way.
Interesting. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I want to be cognizant of time. We're coming up on just a few minutes left, and I think you probably all knew this question was coming, but I'd love to hear your response. We'll start with Greg. How did attending CMU, TEPR, and/or GSIA impact your career?
So it was a real highlight if I look back to both my professional development and personal development. I came to TEPR as a Ford Fellow, and so I really got to explore my interests, knowing that with my partnership with Ford, that I was likely to go back there at least for the rest of my near-term career. And so I just really explored all of the most interesting courses. I did our study abroad program in Europe, and it just rounded out my experience. I came in as an engineer. I'm very focused on engineering within Ford, manufacturing engineering, and came out with a holistic. So it has totally changed my trajectory to be a business leader and a general manager within Ford. And I've spent the last several years of my career running product lines, laying down our electric footprint, which meant government interaction, purchasing, financial analysis. So TEPR, without my TEPR background, I would probably be a manufacturing engineer doing, exciting things in the process, but I would never have had the opportunity to expand my horizons in leadership as well as business acumen without my experience at TEPR.
That's great. It is interesting to hear you talk about both engineering and business. My appointment is in the College of Engineering and in TEPR. Yeah. And as an academic, having that exposure to expertise in both areas has been fantastic for me.
Agree.
Deborah, could you go next and tell us what did attending CMU and TEPR do for you in your career?
Sure. I think, being a CFO, we talk often that there's sort of two types of CFO. You're either an accounting CFO or you're a finance CFO. And you either have a CPA or you have an MBA, or maybe you have both if you have the time, which I did not. So for me, having the MBA is a validating piece of the type of work that I like to do and that I like to focus on. Carnegie Mellon in particular carries with it a very strong brand of being innovative and kind of at the cutting edge, right? So working in the energy industry where smart grid technologies, explorations around how we're going to achieve the energy transition, having a degree from Carnegie Mellon really provides credibility to somebody in my industry in particular and in the role that I have. And then, I just have to say the network of people that I've met as part of being a CMU alumni is, it's just incredible. Particularly some of the GSIA, people who have come through the ranks and, and some of the newer people in more recent years. So I went through my MBA a little later than most people do in their career. And I think it was an invaluable step for me to take.
Thank you for that. It's very nice to hear. I will say in my short time here at CMU, I can't believe it's almost been 5 years. I've had the great experience to interact with alumni from Tepper and alumni from engineering in a number of places. And I emerge from these discussions somehow informed in a new way on an important and interesting topic. And this has certainly been one of those experiences as well. But I share with you that feeling that the community is just incredibly stimulating. Keishi, could you offer an answer to the question about how CMU and GSIA impacted your career?
So 2 things. First is this. I came from Japan, and Pittsburgh is the first U.S. city that I lived in. So I became diehard Steelers fan and Penguins fan. And I feel like I'm so fortunate to have such a strong teams in Pittsburgh. That's number one. Number two is Deborah mentioned, I really appreciate the smallness of the Tepper and CMU. And I'm the old guy here. I'm a class of 89. I cherish the experience of having a personal conversation with Herbert Simon. And I had, found a mentor, Yuji Jiri, the legendary accounting professor. And I have so many opportunities to go to his apartment and drinking sake with him. And that doesn't happen in the big business school.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. I should also say that though I just moved back to Pittsburgh 5 years ago, as I said, I grew up here, came here in the late 70s. So I'm with you on the Steelers and the Penguins there, Keishi. I want to thank our 3 panelists and actually offer John Sengenberger the opportunity to step in if there's a question or two that just came through. John?
Well, there are a couple questions here for Greg. What is the performance range or recharge breakpoint for the mass market customers to move freely to the adoption of EVs for general transportation? Are any hurdles that you're trying to reach at this point?
Yeah, there's a lot to be learned here, right? I mean, adoption rates in the US are still in the single digits. The current approach for customers, probably because of a bit of anxiety, is around more range is just better. The longer range, the bigger battery I can get, the better. I think what people will find as we start making these vehicles truly ubiquitous will be that they're going to understand their drive pattern, and then they'll start adopting, what works best for them. I commute when I'm in the office, I'm commuting 35 miles or 30 miles one way and 30 back. I don't need 400 miles if that's the purpose of my vehicle. So we're really in a seek and understand mode. I would say that about 300 miles seems to be a current, I really want to get to that. But you're going to start seeing with technology advances, 400 miles and beyond. And people will start buying, like they do today, cars that really suit their needs.
Great. Well, I think our time is running out, but let me thank again our speakers for coming and assure our audience that we will be sending out an update from the Alumni Relations Office, giving you some more insight on what's happening in sustainability, giving you some of the links and connections so you can make them with our speakers and have an opportunity to have those kind of questions answered or dialogue or build your network. But thank you today for joining us, Professor Muller. Thank you so much for your time and investment here at the Tepper School. Lester Lave was one of my favorite professors here at Tepper, and I know for many of our alumni, and we're so glad that you're carrying on his great tradition here at the Tepper School. So thanks to our speakers and to our alumni for attending today. We look forward to having you join us for our next Intelligent Future webinar in just 2 weeks. Thank you so much.